So, Exodus chapter 1, this is going to be verses 7 through 14. The previous verses were describing that the generation of Joseph had died off, but that Israel has been flourishing. They have been fulfilling that blessing that God's bestowed on creation back in Genesis 1 and again in Genesis 9 with the being fruitful and multiply. Some people, as we mentioned before, try to tie this to the image, saying that this is part of the image, of which I've mistakenly done that. But that's a blessing that is bestowed upon every living creature in creation. So that's not a differentiating factor, because animals also procreate. And that's just not the image is in general. It's not a set of attributes. In fact, the attributes be better understood as a product of the very fact that we are the image, which is very different than trying to say the attributes are the thing that makes the image itself. Right? Chapter 1, verse 7 through 14. But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. Now there arose a new king over Egypt, who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, "Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. So they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves, and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick, and in all kinds of work in the field. In all their work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. So in chapter 1, verse 7 through 14, which we just read, we see that in the field is where the Israelites are going to be working, is where they'll be slaving away, which is the word is sare, which is referring to the very place that the serpent comes out of. It is the place that Cain drags his brother to kill him. It is the place that Adam is placed to work or to be prior to the planting of the Garden of Eden. So this is the pre-Garden of Eden spot. It's effectively the dry version of the Tehom, which is the chaos, uncreated, disordered region. Adam is here, but then he's put in the garden, and the serpent comes from here into the garden. The brothers, Cain and Abel, Cain drags Abel out to the garden to kill him. This is not the only time we're going to see this kind of thing play out. Now we have slaves who are working in the Masada, outside of Canaan, of which we know they left because it was a way to be protected, and the Pharaoh before was providing a place for Joseph and his family to be so that they could flourish, and because of how much he loved Joseph and how Joseph had done well for him. But now we have this new Pharaoh who is working against this. He's not seeing their multiplication, their fulfillment of this blessing as a good thing. He sees it as a problem. Instead of an opportunity to really go and engage with them and to develop allies, he sees this as an opportunity for his enemies to go up against him. In fact, he says, "Lest they multiply, and if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us." Rather than him thinking, they live in our land, why not team up with them? Build a good relationship. He expects the worst. Sure, you could try and understand that because you're trying to protect your land. They're foreigners, you don't know them. But still, that was a big jump to go there. But anyway, so behold, people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Let us deal shrewdly. If you have the notes, because if you would have those, it's because you're on Spawn. If you don't have notes, I'll quickly just show that I highlighted and underlined. Highlight and underline, let us deal shrewdly with them. So this is him taking to use wisdom. This is not a room, which is used in Genesis 3, but is another word that is in reference to wisdom. So Pharaoh is seeing that they're being blessed, but his response is, I'm going to act shrewdly towards them, to use wisdom against them, to cut off their blessing, to go against the blessing of procreation. And as we mentioned before, the blessing is bestowed upon almost every creature of creation. But human beings especially are given this, and we know in Genesis 9 to kill someone, or to murder them more specifically, is to be an attack on God and a person because human beings are in the image. But here we have this Pharaoh figure who is deciding to work against that very blessing, which the last time we saw this was the garden. The last time we see someone who's actively working against, or more explicitly working against the blessing, is in the garden, where the serpent is seeing the blessing and he works to get them to enter into death rather than being in a place of life. We then see that he then goes to oppress them. So now we have enmity between Egypt and enmity between the Israelites, of which we mentioned before that The seed of the serpent is not directly like snakelings in terms of like literal snakes. It's referring to people, as we saw the very first instance of enmity between two people, of one acting as a serpent and one acting as a seed of the woman, was with Cain and Abel. So now we have Pharaoh acting as a seed of the serpent with an entire nation against another nation within their own places, to then make them be slaves in the field working with mortar and brick. A lot of information. I know my highlights didn't show a ton is because I was looking for more specific language, but you still find the theme here. We still have another Genesis 3 type of event. It's just on a nationwide scale instead of a personal scale, but it's led by a person. So the next thing to notice is that if we look down closer towards the bottom, well, we see that it mentions in mortar and brick. So they're going to be working in bitterness with hard service in mortar and brick. So this is interesting because the last time we hear something very specific regarding mortar and brick is going to be back in Genesis. Again, of course. Why would we would always go back to Genesis? Why wouldn't we? So the last time we see mortar and brick is actually going to be from Genesis 11, which is the creation of the city of Babylon and the Tower of Babylon. Or as many scholars point out, it's going to be more like a ziggurat. It's more like this temple that's supposed to reach up to the heavens, and is in their effort to work in a way where they can avoid spreading, where they can avoid the idea of being flooded by God again, because they're building the city to protect themselves. But also it's their way of trying to go up into the heavens to where God is, and either bring God down to their level or be able for them to go up to his level, and is their way of trying to recreate the Eden spot by their own means apart from God. Obviously, this is not good. This is not this is not tov. It's not even just like evil. It's like, this is not proper. This is not the way to do it. Man is already exiled by themselves due to sin, and they're going against God. So they're kind of like just furthering themselves from God and trying to make their way up to the heavens without God, which makes no sense because that's where God is anyways. But so the brick and mortar is what is developed by the Babylonian people at this time to create their city, to create their tower. However, another interesting part is that Babylon, or Bavel more specifically, is a city of which Nimrod is the father of. So if I'll just read Genesis 10, 8 through 12 real quick. And Cush fathered Nimrod, who was the first on earth to be a mighty warrior. Nimrod, by the way, means rebel, valiant, strong, he that rules rebels. So his name alone tells you that Babylon's origin, even just by the father's name, is a city of rebellion, and those that come from him as well. So he was a mighty hunter before Yahweh. Therefore, it was said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before Yahweh. Now the beginning of his kingdom was Bavel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in this land of Shinar. From that land, he went to Assyria, and he built Nineveh, Rehoboth, Kala, Resen, between Nineveh and Kala. That is the great city. So he's the father of like some of the big cities that we kind of hear about, or nations that we hear about, especially Akkad, Bavel, and Nineveh, probably the most famous ones, where they engage in back and forth turmoil and frustration with Israel. So that's Genesis 10, where he's the father of this. So his name is Rebel, which I find funny that, Bugs Bunny is actually the one that changed the name or the idea, where he calls Elmer Fudd Nimrod. Some could say, okay, this is where he starts to take as an idiot, but it's more of him using sarcastically, because Nimrod is a great hunter and Elmer Fudd's not. So it's him sarcastically calling them this, and then we just changed the word to mean idiot. But it means rebel. It means valiant, strong rebel, and we know that he was also a great hunter and a great warrior. But we then have Genesis 11, 1 through 4. Now the whole earth had one language and the same words, and as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to each other, come, let us make brick and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone, and they had tar for mortar. And they said, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower whose tops reaches to the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered over the face of the whole earth. So we have Egypt earlier describing that they're going to enslave Israel into working with brick and mortar. They're going to do it out in the Sade, which is already they're outside of the promised land, but now they're even further, like they're in the wilderness area of sorts. So the dry land within Egypt, but they're not in the wilderness where they can give sacrifices as Moses is going to free them to do, or God's going to free them through Moses to do. And we have a Pharaoh who sees this, and he's going to use his wisdom negatively to an attack, to bring oppression, slavery to an entire nation, because he's afraid that he might lose his power, or that they might rise up against him with another nation. So Egypt already within this little bit should be seen as the continual problem of the human project and enmity between serpent and the woman growing. Egypt is worse than the Genesis 11 in that instead of people working together in disobedience, they are enslaving people to work for them while also acting out in disobedience to God. There's also an attack of the blessing and fruitfulness. They're trying to cut off Israel from being able to be fruitful and multiply. So they're trying to remove that entire blessing of which God gives humanity from the very beginning to go do. Then there's also an attack on their lives in general because they're just wiping them out so that way there is no rising up against them, as many as they can. But of course, we see later on that there are many women, the midwives, and then Moses' sister and Moses' mother, as well as a few others who seek to protect these young boys so that Israel can still flourish. It's hard to have slaves if you kill off all the males and leave the females with no one to marry. I guess you could with an Egyptian, but then there's the whole question of, do you accept the half Egyptian, half Israelite? Do you enslave them? Do you keep them? But all this is done is what seems right to Pharaoh. And effectively, this is him being the snake over all of the people. And we'll see in a little bit that I'm not making this up. Later, biblical writers and even Moses kind of look back on everything that's going on as it is a Genesis 3 serpent type of event. The next appearance we're going to see of our very specific serpent language, which thank goodness we finally got there. The question that is being asked by Moses is like, okay, what if they don't believe me? That you sent me here, right? Because you have effectively been, in their minds, quiet and gone for years, for a long time, that Yahweh has just kind of left us to be enslaved. They probably have a hard time remembering who Yahweh really is because they spent so much time in Egypt. They have some memory because God's playing into their idea of knowing about the God of Jacob and the God of Abram and all these things that like they understand their ancestry, but they don't know him like they knew him, right? There's this distance that seems to be put in place. They have less reason to believe that he's there or he's going to do anything because he's allowed them to be in slavery. So he's like, what if they don't believe me? So, of course, he says, what is in your hand? And he says a staff, and he says, throw on the ground. He threw it on the ground, it became a nachash. So that's where we have our serpent word, one of them. It says nachash. And Moses runs from it, right? I mean, that is almost like half the people by life's first response would be to run away from a snake. Some other people, they're kind of interested in this. They might explore it. But what's interesting is that God then tells him to catch it by the tail. Grabbing him by the tail is known to most people as not the safest thing in the world, but God tells him to do it, and he does it. So we're getting Yahweh's telling him to trust him with this dangerous thing, what is just called a nachash, which is the serpent, to grab it by the tail, and he has to trust that Yahweh is going to provide this thing to turn back into a staff, or that is not going to strike him, that is not going to hurt him. This is right after the question of what if they don't believe me, right? They will not believe me or listen to my voice, for they will say the Lord did not appear to you. Like, he's already just throwing it out there. And his response is, throw your staff down. Look, it's a snake. It's a serpent. Grab it by the tail. This is effectively Yahweh kind of showing him just how easy it's going to be for him to overthrow Pharaoh. With Yahweh, one can have power over the serpent, but without him, we are powerless. With the backdrop, we are setting up with Egypt and Pharaoh as a dragon. This could also be Yahweh showing Moses that with him, the dragon, which is Pharaoh, which is going to be Egypt, is going to be conquered, and it will be done in a way that appears to be dangerous, but is going to be done effectively, and it will be swift and easy for Yahweh. And then we see the whole put your hand in your cloak, and it's leprous. He puts it back in, he pulls it back out, and it's perfectly fine again. So he's showing these miracles that are also going to be part of the plagues or part of the response that even Pharaoh is going to witness in some way. Pharaoh is going to be seeing, as we'll see in Exodus 7, serpents coming from staffs. Then he said to Moses and Aaron, when Pharaoh says to you, prove yourselves by working a miracle, then you shall say to Aaron, take your staff and cast it down before Pharaoh, that it may become a nachash. So Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and did just as the Lord commanded. Aaron cast down his staff before Pharaoh and his servants, and it became a tanin. Then Pharaoh summoned the wise men and the sorcerers, and they, the magicians of Egypt, also did the same by their secret arts. For each man cast down his staff, and they became tanin. But Aaron's staff swallowed up their staffs. And I made a mistake. The first serpent should also be tanin, not nachash. So before Moses is shown this nachash that comes from the staff, now we have Aaron's staff as a tanin. It's the exact same thing that Moses saw, but is given this like cosmic backdrop instead. This like grander, more significant image, if you will, of like not even just now as a serpent or this land dragon. It's the sea dragon of sorts. It is the dragon word that is being used to describe the staffs. Now, I don't think that what we're meant to see here is that I don't know where the staffs turn to Smog from Lord of the Rings, because this is something that one doesn't really seem surprising to anyone. nor is it describing anything like super destructive. It just describes that we have serpents, which beforehand we saw was in the wilderness with Moses and the burning bush. But now we have it here, and it is Aaron's staff that is going to swallow the staves of the other, which is also a motif that is from the other ancient Near Eastern texts of what the Tannin, the Leviathan, the dragons do, is that they swallow up, they eat and destroy things. In this case, it is Aaron's staff, the staff of Yahweh, that is going to swallow up the staffs of these other people who are doing the exact same thing. So we have the same cosmic significance between the two, but one has the ability to swallow up the other, and it doesn't seem to describe it as having a struggle. And so we have Pharaoh, who is the big snake, calling on his little snakes to throw out other snakes to, try to show that, okay, sure, you can do this, but we can do this too. But now we have Aaron's staff is the one that is eating it. So this comes from John Walton. The Hebrew word for snake in this verse is different from the one used in chapter 4, verse 3. The word here can refer to a sea monster, dragon, sometimes crocodile or snake. More often is used in terms of this cosmic dragon. The purpose of this event is also different. The sign with Moses' staff was for Israelites, for the Israelite elders. They saw and initially believed Moses. The sign with Aaron's staff is for Pharaoh and his officials and demonstrates what appears to be an assault on Egyptian ideology. If Aaron's staff did indeed become a snake, then its devouring of the magician snake, on the one hand, demonstrates an overpowering of the magicians and even a commandeering of their own abilities and expertise. On the other hand, it could also serve as an attack on the snake as a symbol of Egyptian power. It is hard to know, though, whether Aaron's staff was supposed to become a serpent that the Egyptians feared and despised or one that they worshipped. In either case, the narrative describes the actions of Moses and Aaron as an emphatic display of power. So either way, regardless of how they're supposed to be responding to this, apart from the fact that they threw down their staffs at the same thing, this is an attack on Egypt in some way. It's a different kind of sign, which seems to be why there's a different language, a different term that is used to describe here. Before we have this image that's going to be used for Israel, but now we have this on this cosmic scale, that God has come and Yahweh has come to Egypt and he's going to overthrow Egypt. He's going to overthrow the Pharaoh. He's going to overthrow all the other gods. They're going to be effectively nothing to him. He's going to cast them all over. His serpent, his tool, his dragon, his miracles will swallow up and destroy them. Their oppression will no longer continue. Another one from Carol Myers. This word denotes a larger, more terrifying beast or sea monster and is part of the mythic vocabulary of the Hebrew Bible. It represents the forces of chaos as antithetical to God's will. It serves to dragonize the Pharaoh in keeping with the mythic imagery also present in Ezekiel 29. Note that Psalm 74:13 equates the splitting of the sea with the breaking heads of the Tannim, which is our Hebrew word for dragons, in the waters. Thus, the swallowing of the Egyptian rod serpent anticipates the swallowing of the Egyptians in the sea and the termination of oppression chaos. So she sees this is also like a foreshadowing of what's going to happen to them. Because if you have a Tannin that's typically in the sea, and they're soon going to be swallowed up by the sea when they go to pursue Israel. So there's a lot that could be happening here. Regardless of the fact we have this word change, we have this cosmological word that's being used to describe something chaotic, something that is cosmic, something that is destructive. This tool is being used now in God's favor against them rather than it being something that's going to be oppressing Israel. Pharaoh is being depicted more and more as a snake who has serpents producing snakes. The snake with snakelings fight with snakes. I just find that a fun statement to say. The staff is used again as a tool to split the waters, as we're going to see in a minute, and it is the same staff that's also going to be used to bring some of the plagues, which is going to be really interesting. In fact, it is like when Pharaoh is floating in the Nile, in the waters, they use a staff to turn it to blood, which is interesting because in a different passage we'll see in a minute, it's equating of Pharaoh, not this Pharaoh, with a Tannin who's swimming in the Nile, as if it is their place. Again, different Pharaoh. It's one of, I think it's Ezekiel's day, not of Moses' day, but very similar thing. They have access to the Nile, and God is going to be showing that you don't really have control over the things you think you do. It's kind of like the Princess Bride. I don't think that word means what you think it means. And that's effectively what God's about to do. I don't think that land belongs to you like you think it does. Let's look at some of the prophets. We're going to be looking at Isaiah, we're going to be looking at Exodus, and we're going to be looking at like Ezekiel as well. I'll tell you right now, Isaiah, he'll be looking back on Exodus. Ezekiel is taking some of that language, but he's not looking back necessarily on that same event. He's looking back on Pharaoh, looking at Pharaoh in general. Isaiah specifically is going to be looking back on this event, and then we'll look at what he's reading. So Isaiah 30, verse 7, Egypt's help is worthless and empty. Therefore, I, being Yahweh, have called her Rahav, who sits still. This was not an original list of chaos monster words. It is a name of a dragon, almost always in reference to Egypt, because of the very things that Egypt has done towards Israel, towards God's people, this dragging them back into disorder, into chaos. Because disorder and chaos, as we mentioned before, but I'll re-mention it again, is not an opposite of God. It is the opposite of creation. To be created is to be in a state of order in life, but to drag something into a state of disorder is to drag it into death, which means that it is taking life away from us. It is putting us in a state of death, whereas God just is. There is no equal opposite to him, but people will act in opposition to him by going after his people, by going after his creation. And that is how they oppose him. But they can't actually oppose him ontologically or anything like that because, well, he's God and there's no one else like him. So, right down here, as you just read, awake, put on the strength. So, arm of the Lord in reference to his power. It's interesting. It's described as if his arm of the Lord, as if the arm of the Lord is sleeping. Sometimes, we hear things that are just kind of interesting where they, if Yahweh's sleeping, if he's not acting in power, then maybe he's not listening to us. Maybe he's sleeping. Like this idea that they question sometimes if God is listening, because it seems like God sometimes comes and goes. Yes, we know God is omniscient, but they still have the idea of like God's presence being something that is actually among them. Like when he fills the temple, or when there is the pillar of fire and the smoke and the storm clouds and all those things. His idea of his manifested presence. So they're questioning like, where are you? Like what's happening? Are you asleep? Because Isaiah is now looking back on Exodus as a way to describe, like, this is what you've done for Israel, then do this for Israel now. So he says, was it not you who cut Rahav in pieces, of which we, in our very first session, we saw in, I think it was the Epic of Gilgamesh, where you have Marduk who rips apart Tiamat and cuts her up. You have in the Rig Veda where he defeats the Indian god, defeats the dragon and cuts him up, and a variety of other things, crushes its head. So he's saying, was it not you who did this? Was it not you who cut up Rahav, who pierced the dragon? Was it not you who defeated this chaos monster? Was it not you who dried up the sea? So the Yam, the Mayim of the great Tahom, who made the depths of the Yam a way for the redeemed to pass over. He's looking back on this event of the parting of technically it's the Sea of Reeds. Isaiah is describing this as a chaos monster crushing event, as if it is part of the same narrative dialogues that the other nations had for their creation. He's looking at this as a creation moment. We'll see why, even in the Hebrew Bible, that is the case too. So Exodus 14, verse 21 through 29, then Moses stretched out his hand over the Yam, and Yahweh drove the Yam back by a strong east wind all night and made the sea dry land. And the waters were divided, and the people of Israel went into the midst of the sea on dry ground. So that's what we have right here, who made the depths of the sea a way for the redeemed to pass over. The waters being a wall to them on the right and on their left, the Egyptians pursued and went in after them into the midst of the sea, all Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen. And in the morning watch the Lord in the pillar of fire and cloud looked down on the Egyptian forces and threw the Egyptian forces into a panic, clogging their chariots and wheels, so that they drove heavily. And the Egyptians said, let us flee from before Israel, for the Lord fights for them against the Egyptians. Then Yahweh said to Moses, stretch out your hand over the Yam, that the Mayim may come back upon the Egyptians, upon their chariots, and upon their horsemen. So Moses stretched out his hand over the Yam, and the Yam returned to its normal course. And when the morning appeared, and as the Egyptians fled into it, the Lord threw the Egyptians into the midst of the Yam. Mayim returned and covered the chariots and the horsemen of all the hosts of Pharaoh that had followed them into the Yam. Not one of them remained, but the people of Israel walked on dry ground through the sea, the waters being a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. So I think we see, we're still looking at my screen here, was it not you who drive the sea, the waters of the great deep, who made the depths of the sea a way for the redeemed to pass over? I think we saw that very quickly. Was it not you who crushed Rahav, the dragon? Well, that would be when the water is coming back over. The water is crushing onto the Egyptians. This is him defeating Egypt finally. Not just like this continual like battle, if you will, but this conquering moment where now the waters have completely come back over them. That Isaiah is looking at this as a chaos dragon conquering myth type of thing where they use this to describe creation of sorts. And I mentioned that the Hebrew Bible does the same. So in the beginning, God created the Shamayim and the Eretz, or Aretz, technically due to its grammar, but Eretz is the root word. So as I mentioned before, this is very much is going to be like a statement. Because for a few things, one's a merism, heavens and earth. Well, things have been created yet in terms of everything. We have 6 creation days plus the 7th of resting to go through. And not only that, but if we were to get like at face value, the Shamayim is not made yet, and the Eretz is, well, presently underwater. Verse 2, now the earth was formless and empty, so tovu vavohu, so formless meaning that it was without order, without structure, it is not inhabitable. Empty meaning that, well, there is no life on it. There is no life. It is empty. It is some translations, Septuagint goes with it's unfurnished. It is not filled. So we have that the Eretz is without form. It is not inhabitable, and it has no life on it. There is no filling. And darkness was over the face of the Tehom, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. So we have Tehom, chaos water here, but now we have the Spirit of God, or what's interesting is we have the word Ruach, of which, if we go back into our earlier passage, where it mentions a strong east wind, which is also the word Ruach, that moves the waters, we have the Ruach of God was hovering over the surface of the waters, of which is the same word that is going to separate the waters in Exodus. And we can skip day 1 for now. We spent a long time with that a few weeks ago. And by long, I mean not enough at all. We didn't really define it much. But we go here, and God saw that there be a vaulted dome, or a rakia, in the midst of the waters, which is going to be the waters that precede day 1 up here, because they get the word change from chaos water to simple water because Spirit of God is present. So he makes the rakia to separate the waters from the waters. So there's a water above, which is where we get Shamayim up here. I know I'm jumping around, but here, Shamayim. So we have Mayim as part of it, which is the same word right here. We just don't have the Sha. We have Ha, but not use the. So the waters above and the waters below are being separated with the rakia. And then we go to day 3, where it says, and God let the Mayim that are under the heavens, which is going to be the rakia, because the rakia is called Shamayim in day 2. Let the waters below the heavens, aka the rakia, be gathered to one place, and let dry ground appear. So let's move the waters so that the dry ground can be seen, of which is the exact same thing that we see in Exodus 14. So if we go to verse 21, Moses stretched out his hand over the Yam, which is what the waters are called in day 3, the waters below, that is. And Yahweh moved the Yahweh with a strong east ruach, right here, all night, and he made the sea become dry ground. Interesting that he mentions all night. Hold on to that. And he made the sea become dry ground. When did that happen before? Well, that happened in Genesis chapter 1. The waters were divided. Well, that also happened in chapter 1. Israelites enter the middle of the sea on the dry land, and they're passing through it now. So they're passing through the created land, the land that is now seen and able to be used, and describes that the waters are as a wall, and the Egyptians gave chase. However, so we got the creation part. So Israel is walking through the waters into new creation. They're leaving Egypt and entering into new creation, which will be over on their way towards Canaan. Now, Caleb and I did an entire podcast episode on this before too, so I'll make it very brief. But if we go to Exodus 15 as well and read part of the song that they sing, let me sing to Yahweh because he is highly exalted. The horse and his rider he hurled into the Yam. Yah is my strength and song. He has become my salvation. This is my Elohim. I will praise him, the Elohim of my father, and I will exalt him. Yahweh is a man of war. That's important for a study on angel of the Lord and his 2 powers of heaven, which we may do hopefully soon. Yahweh is his name. The chariots of Pharaoh and his army he cast into the sea, and his choice adjutants were sunk in the Red Sea. The Tehomot, which is the root word Tehom, which is the water that are used to describe pre-day 1 waters, covered them. Okay, this is important. They went down into the depths like a stone. There, I mentioned there's another passage that is being used here, and it's going to be the flood narrative. Because in the flood narrative, we get, first off, the returning of Genesis 1 language of water, where you have the waters of the deep. But you also have the fact that it is a reversal of Genesis 1. So before you have light, you have its boundaries, you have water. And then in the flood, well, if you have rain, you have clouds covering over. So there's darkness, and the waters from above and below are being rejoined together. And now they're covering the Eretz once again. And it's wiping out all the things that are filled on the dry land. And you have a little Eden spot within the ark. That's important to keep notice. But they're being decreated. They're going through a uncreated moment where there's now darkness and perpetual darkness and waters covering over everything again. It is back to the pre-day one state. And then it says God remembers Noah. And what does he do? Light comes out. The waters start receding. He sends the animals back and forth. Eventually, they're on a dry ground, and they exit onto everything, so we get a recreation. So the Exodus for the Israelites is that they go through, one, an Exodus, the break they're getting out of, but also the Egyptian army goes through a chaos monster showdown where they're being crushed, and they are going through a decreation, which is also being shown within the plagues. But while that's all happening, Israel is passing through, like Noah does in the ark, or over, into new life, into new creation. This is another motif that we won't trace because we have one focus more specifically. But this motif is also used frequently to describe new creation, life, Jesus, the church, Israel itself in general, going through new creations, going through the chaos waters, going through this stuff, of which we'll see a lot with Jesus when we get to the New Testament as well. These last two are from Ezekiel. Again, they're not looking back on Egypt in the past. However, you can still use some of it to describe how Yahweh and Israelites view Egypt when reading the Exodus, but he's also writing stuff down for Egypt then. But we'll go there. Ezekiel 29, this will be verse 3 through 5. Behold, I, Yahweh, am against you. It's going to be Pharaoh, king of Egypt, the great dragon that lies in the midst of his streams, that says, my Nile is my own. I made it for myself. I'll put hooks in your jaws and make the fish your streams stick to your scales. And I, just again, is Yahweh, will draw you out of the midst of your streams with all the fish of your streams that stick to your scales. And I will cast you into the wilderness, you and all the fish of your streams. You shall fall on the open sade, or field, and not be brought together or gathered. To the beasts of the earth and to the birds of the heavens I give you as food. This is a prophet using language of Isaiah and of Exodus to describe the Pharaoh of this time. We have him being called a great dragon, a tanin, in the midst of the waters in the Nile, of which Pharaoh in Exodus is swimming in the Nile. And then it's turned to blood. But he treats it like it's its own. And then God basically says, I'm going to yank you out of the water. I'm going to destroy you. I'm going to kill you. You're going to fall apart. And you'll basically no longer be this great dragon that you think you are. But this is an example of where we have dragon language being used to describe nations and government powers, or specifically a person. Before we had it referencing with Cain and Abel, where it was implying that Cain is a seed of the serpent. He's acting as a serpent. And then you just get Ezekiel, who does not pull punches. And he's like, no, this is just a straight up dragon. And he will be destroyed. He will be crushed. He will be yanked out of the sea, out of the streams, out of the waters. God doesn't pull punches when it comes to his chaos crushing language. Actually, God doesn't really pull punches in general. He'll just tell you how it's going to be. There's a lot of colorful language, but there is descriptions of decreation where you have like everything going dark, and there's like no longer presence of, like, whether it be like out of the waters entirely, there's no presence of waters, as we see with Genesis 2, or we see there is only presence of water like we see in Genesis 1. You see him talking about destroying him and cutting him up. This all plays into language. I mean, Ezekiel, let's remember where he's at too. Ezekiel initially is in the Babylonian exile. So he's very familiar as well with the language of Marduk and Baal in their creation epics, where they fight a dragon and what it says about them. And he's using some of the same language, even though he's talking to Egypt, because Egypt would know of this, even though they had a different narrative entirely. So God through Ezekiel is describing how that chaos dragons, effectively, whether they be spiritual beings, nations, people, they may think they have their day, they think they'll have their time, but he will judge them, he will destroy them, he will stop them. And in their case, there was coming a day when there would be a one who crushes the dragon, once and for all, who does the full job. But then that same person teaches that there will be a future day where the dragon will be thrown and cast off into the lake of fire for eternity. And so this is part of the dragon slaying myth. Both passages treat Egypt, Pharaoh, as a dragon. This nation, it's specifically for how it has treated Israel in the past and in their case, the present. And they will be facing the consequences for acting as agents of disorder and death, protecting oneself over others. They act as agents of death and deceit and chaos because they're more concerned about looking out for themselves than looking out for others. Israel's whole mission, part of their whole mission, I wouldn't say their whole mission, but part of their whole mission is that within Israel you have the 12 nations, 12 tribes, but within those you have the Levites, who are the priests to the 12. Because remember, Joseph's children are divided into 2 tribes when the Levites are selected. And so the Levites are the priests to Israel. And Israel is supposed to act as the priests to the world. So their job is supposed to be, 1, keeping their covenant with the Lord, but also being a light unto the world. And then as Christians, we're called on this global scale, not on a national scale, to be the temple, to be the priests, to be the light, to be these representatives out into the world towards each other and towards those who are not in the kingdom and towards those who are in the kingdom. And there is a day that will come when the dragon slaying myth will be no more. The dragon slaying language will be gone because there will be no need for it. The dragon will be destroyed. So this was just one example. This is if we're doing a theme study, you got to go from beginning to end. You can't just skip around. I know I did a little skipping by using passages that are looking back on specific events. So they're part of the same narrative. So we're going in order of how they show up and then using anything that ties together. But that is the whole thing with Exodus. I mean, the first half of it is really the discussion of this question of, will Israel trust in God to be free when God says that he will free them, that he will overthrow the dragon, that he will destroy them, and destroy the dragon and his little snake wings, destroy and conquer and basically turn very easily this chaos creature into nothing, of which he demonstrates. And this is the thing that they've witnessed. This is one of the events that Israel is called repeatedly to reflect on. The Torah is the 5 pillars, you could say, of the entire Bible in terms of its narrative structure. Everything, especially the Old Testament, derives from its teachings of the Torah. They either reflect back on the Torah, they describe things in the Torah, or they're using language from the Torah. And the pillar and the foundations, the bedrock for the Torah is Genesis and Exodus, because they set up all the language that the rest of the Torah plays into. So that is a big part of the whole narrative that's being taken place in the Bible that Jesus also will play into when we eventually get there.